Hello, you've reached SJ Thomason with Christian-Apologist.com, and I'm really excited that today I'm here with two very special guests. They're two Christian gentlemen that I know. One's name's Duncan, and one's name is Andrew. And so we're going to start up right now. Well, let me go ahead and first have you two introduce yourselves. Maybe we'll start with Andrew, since I see you first on my screen, and then we'll go to Duncan.
Sure thing. I'm Andrew Stratelates. I occasionally am on the Red Pill Religion podcast and blog at redpillreligion.com. And I am very active on Twitter at Stratelates. I talk about the theism, traditionalism, Christianity, religion, and occasionally anime. So that's where most of my sort of apologetics work is. And I'm very happy to be here today, SJ. Thank you for having me on.
Thank you for coming. Duncan?
Yes, can you hear me?
Maybe get a little bit louder.
Yeah, my name is Duncan, and I'm glad to be here.
Excellent, excellent. So today what we're going to talk about is all three of us have been on social media interacting a lot, and a lot of us interact with people who share different opinions. So a number of people in a different group who share different opinions, and many of them are atheists, or they're agnostics, or sometimes we even interact with people who might be of a different religious faith other than Christianity. Today, for example, I interact a little bit with a woman who is a Jew for Jesus, so she's got a slightly different angle on certain things. And yesterday, why don't I start us off with this particular conversation that Andrew and I were in yesterday, where we talked about whether or not the Muslim God, Allah, is the same as the Christian and the Jewish God, the head of the, if you want to say the head, but basically Yahweh. So I wanted to hear what your feelings are on that. I would say, I'll just say right off the bat, no, they're not the same. But I'm curious to hear what you two think.
Sure, I'll go ahead and I'm not sure what Duncan will say, but I have a different perspective that the Muslim understanding of God has the same reference as the Christian and Jewish reference, but they have some distortions and things that they're missing in that. It's similar to, for example, let's say that we're both at a party and you reference, oh, that guy wearing the suit jacket and drinking a cocktail. That person is Jonathan, and you're mistaken on that, and he's not drinking a cocktail, but he's actually a teetotaler and drinking water. Just because I look and see water and you see him in a cocktail, doesn't mean that we're referencing the same person, even though one of us clearly has false beliefs about that person. And so that's my perspective. And it comes from my sort of philosophical background. I would assert that even Brahman of the Hindus is God, the Great Spirit of the Native Americans is God, but they all have either distortions or lacks in their understanding, which is fully revealed in Jesus Christ of Nazareth and the Christian religion.
That's very interesting. What do you think, Duncan? Might have lost Duncan for a second there. So I wanted to add on to what you said as far as I agree with you to some extent, but I also wanted to add that the idea that to be a Christian, our main premise is the idea of the resurrection. So if you're going to be a Christian, you have to truly believe that Jesus resurrected from the dead. I think that's the one thing that people who call themselves Christians really need to come to an agreement on. I don't think the whole idea of being a liberal Christian, where you just accept Jesus as a teacher and you think that he didn't necessarily rise from the dead, I don't think that's a legitimate Christian position. I used to be like that, so that's why I can say that. I know that my previous position was not legitimate. But one thing that Muslims believe, because of a certain way that it was phrased in the Quran, is that God took Jesus to heaven prior to the resurrection. And many think that must mean that somebody else took his place on the cross. And to me, that's the one clincher where I would say this means absolutely the two are not the same. So I wouldn't, because basically Muhammad is discounting the one thing that Christians really stand for.
Sure. And the only point that I would make with that is, if that's the standard that you're making, that the Christian God, to be God, it has to include the divinity of the person of Christ and the resurrection of Christ, then by that definition, Judaism does not worship the same God, because modern Judaism denies the resurrection and divinity of Christ, and they tend to think that that's ontologically impossible in the same sense that Muslims do. And and we can get into the difference between reference and form, but that definition of the true God, or what have you, or one God, is very narrow, which has upsides and downsides, right? That it makes it very clear what is Christian worship and what isn't, but it also breaks our ability to articulate the shared truths we have with other faith traditions.
I agree with you. I think that, and that's actually some of the strongest. So you're right. The Orthodox Jewish position is basically not to accept Jesus as a savior, but maybe to say he was a good moral teacher. One of the things I think with that position that is interesting is a lot of the people that I know who happen to be Orthodox Jews, and I was living in a town where about half of the people in that town were Jewish, in Boca Raton, Florida. It's well-known Jewish enclave, and so I met a lot of Jewish people, and many of them had that view. But it was interesting because of the ones I've met, they really don't study the scriptures too well. I mean, they don't study. When I said, "What do you think of Isaiah 53?" Because of course I am bold and I do ask that. So they say Isaiah 53. Oh, we don't really talk about that. Or I'll say, "What do you think about Daniel 9? What's your take on the timing of Daniel 9?" Because if you look at Daniel 9 and you take it as the decree of Artaxerxes, which is 77s, and that starts at the date of 444 BC, and you put together these 360-day Jewish calendar years, the date comes out to, after you figure it all out, and you look at some of the other dates that are in there in Ezra and Nehemiah, the date comes out to 33 AD, which is supposed the date where the anointed one would make an appearance. And so, or the anointed one would be essentially crucified or cut off from the world. And so I think when you look at those passages in the Old Testament, to me, they're very compelling. And the people who are the best interpreters of those are the Jews for Jesus. They're very impressive with their biblical knowledge, and they actually go through the streets of Jerusalem and other places with the scriptures, showing people those passages to convert people. So I think that's really pretty compelling. Have we got Duncan back yet? Darn, he's got some sound issues, it sounds like.
Yeah, and well, I mean, I'm biased because I'm a Christian, so that is, in my interpretive context, Isaiah and Daniel point to the Messiah, who is actually Jesus the Christ of Nazareth, and that's one of the things that I think that the Jews are mistaken on, and Muslims on, that Jesus is the Messiah. Some Muslims say that he was, in some sense, and some actual Jews will articulate a very limited sense of messiahship that Jesus might have affirmed, but that he was actually God incarnate. And this is like the fundamental difference between Christianity and basically all the other religions, in that Christ incarnate is the Logos and the God who is the ground of being, who instantiated and incarnated in a historical person of Christ. And the Orthodox Jewish tradition of interpretation I have a lot of respect for, because they're very thoughtful and careful about what they preserve. And they've preserved things that are very useful for Christians to understand as well, especially in relation to Deuteronomy and Numbers and some of the law books in the Torah. But one of the things that I think they do get wrong is how they interpret Isaiah to be an allegory of the Jewish people rather than the person of the Messiah. And and that's sort of the thing, is the interpretive context in some sense is almost as important as the scripture itself for determining these types of things. And their tradition and our tradition diverged about 2,000 years ago, and we have a lot of the same things, right? Where we tend to be very rigorous in our analysis and things like that, and it is really fascinating to talk to some of these converts from Judaism to Christianity, and some of the flavor or some of the context of like first century Judaism and how Christ played into that can be very helpful for Christians. That is actually preserved in the rabbinical tradition.
Yeah, I agree. And I second your point. I think it is wonderful the way that they were so carefully preserving so much of their information. And they carefully preserve things like their genealogies. They were very, very specific about that. And even if you look at the Dead Sea Scrolls and what care they took to save those, and they ended up being recovered finally not too long ago. So relatively speaking. So it's a very impressive tradition. And another thing that I just want to point out that maybe some people aren't aware of, Malachi 3:1 very specifically said that the anointed one would appear in the temple. And of course, the second temple was still around at that point. And Malachi was written, it's my understanding, about 400 years before Jesus walked the earth. And Jesus did appear in the temple many times. He actually went and he taught there. So the temple was destroyed in the year 70. And I think that would tell us, if you look at that the anointed one had to come prior to the year 70. And so I think that's something also that we can speak to.
Yeah, definitely. Although, and I don't know the exegesis of rabbinical Judaism that much, but I guess the counter to that would be that the temple has been rebuilt before, and that might be a predecessor necessary for the Jewish Messiah. And so, I think that's definitely a good pivot or a good fact to talk about. But the issue, of course, is that the interpretive structure, it depends on what you're willing to give up, right? And stuff like that. And similarly, and I'll just talk about this a little bit, just so that we're clear, is that just because you worship God doesn't mean that your beliefs about God are correct. And the key, one of the key errors of Islam, at least from the Christian perspective, is that it's basically resembles Arianism, which is the teaching of Arius, that Christ was not divine. And they actually affirm the virgin birth. The Muslims do affirm the virgin birth. They have a high view of Mary, but they think that Christ is just a prophet. And that's incorrect. And of course, there's a lot of strife and religious persecution of certain Christian minorities in Muslim countries, like the Coptics, are horribly persecuted in Egypt. The same thing is happening to the Iraqi Christians and these places with majority Muslim populations. And my basic thing is, I'm more than happy to call out errors that people make, but I'm going to call you out on the exact error you make, not try not to brush, not to paint with a broad brush.
That's a great point. And I think that also reminds me of something that's important that people might not realize. It's another distinction between Christianity and the Muslim faith. Is the Muslim faith was founded on war immediately. Even Muhammad himself went and killed bunches of people who were Jewish, for example. He had a number of people beheaded. And the Christian faith in the first few hundred years was very peaceful. And people were living by the idea that if they live by the sword, they'll die by the sword. So Christians in the first few hundred years, while Christianity had not even had legal protections, Christians were a peace-loving people, and it was founded in a completely different way. And despite the fact that they were persecuted so heavily, by 313, when Constantine finally gave them legal protections, about 5 to 6 million people were following this faith. And I think that says a lot, because it wasn't a faith that was built out of warrior sorts of mentalities, and that's exactly what started Islam. They immediately started conquering lands and converting people forcefully, and if you didn't convert, you'd get beheaded. And we still see some of that going on today, which is what you mentioned with the Coptic Christians in Egypt. Many of them were beheaded on a beach, and it was televised.
Yeah, and I have the most respect for what I'll call classical Islam, which has a very thoughtful and elaborate legal system of analysis of what's permitted and what isn't. And even under classical Islam, wars of conquest are actually permissible. While in Christianity, that's never permissible. I mean, there's a spectrum of different views that Christians take, but the most liberal Christians take something, the most liberal position on war that Christians take that's defensible is something called just war doctrine, which basically means that we can go to war as a last resort as long as we use minimal force necessary and are doing more good than the evil that comes of it. And you know, there's issue with that because Christians don't always live up to that ideal, but that's the ideal. That we are allowed to engage in warfare in a limited sense in this fallen world for protecting innocence and so on and so forth. And Islam actually has more sort of the Roman or pre-Christian idea that you absolutely have to follow the treaties you make. That's actually big in Islamic thought, that you have to abide by treaties. But besides that, it's actually legitimate to engage in warfare for conquest.
Yeah, so and Duncan's back. I noticed, I don't know, Duncan, have you been able to get your sound up? I can kind of very faintly hear you. Oh, you just put it on mute. Okay, so he might be working on his sound. He's been having a little bit of an issue today. So it'd be great if we get him back on here. So Andrew, those are some really good points that we have seen with respect to Muslim faith, the Muslim faith. I think that maybe it might be interesting to talk about some of the other issues that you and I and Duncan have encountered on social media, where people talk about things like slavery in the Bible. And they say that Christ came and he said he wasn't going to get rid of the laws. But then again, he said, we say he fulfilled the laws, and that at that point, we're basically told to love our neighbors as ourselves and love the Lord above all else. And so, those are the rules that Jesus took, the 10 Commandments. He didn't keep the Sabbath one in there, and then he retained to the other ones that basically sum up the other 9 commandments. So, in that respect, I try to make the argument that if we look at the way that Christians live and have been living since Christ, Christians were the ones who tried to abolish slavery. So a lot of people say, well, that's too bad. I still see slavery in the Bible and it's still condoned. So do you have an answer to any of that kind of stuff? Because that's one that I see all the time.
Sure. The key pivot here, or one of the key pivots, is on what does it mean to condone? If you actually look at the dictionary definition of what condone means, it means to permit out of mercy. And then the modern usage or colloquial usage is to approve of, and so, you know, let's assume that you're a parent of a teenager who's 16 and can drive, right? And they break curfew by 15 minutes. If you don't punish them for that because they came 15 minutes after, that's actually condoning their behavior. But you might be doing that prudently, because if you give them some leeway for coming close to curfew, they won't stay out all night. But if you very, very consistently said, okay, if you break curfew by 1 minute, you will be grounded for a week. They might not just break curfew for 1 minute, but they would break curfew and come back the next morning, right? And that's a larger infraction, but because you very inflexibly are like, no tolerance, the punishment for breaking curfew is a week, always and always, then they actually will do more wrong. And part of the issue with the Old Testament laws is that they were given to the Jewish people to form them into something better than what they were. And the laws that were given to them were the best laws that they were able to do. And so we have to realize that the condoning of it wasn't saying that it was moral, but it was actually done out of mercy. And the purpose in that is to form them into the people that would give rise to the Messiah, who would bring about the redemption of the world. And, we can get into, well, why does God work in history? And the key thing there is we exist in history. And so that's sort of the key part. And, or why didn't God just snap his fingers and outlaw slavery? And the true answer to this is we are physical beings, right? We're animals, literally. But we also have transcendent things as well. And the transcendent things of us, of our reason and our ability to relate to God and to other things in the way that God relates to them, is more important than our animal nature. And basically, by permitting some of these things, we are able to bring forth something that's greater for our salvation than that. And I have to note that God is able to do this because God has infinite wisdom. And so our ability to do this is slacking compared to this, but this is actually how we do laws now too, right? That, for example, the reason that no-fault divorce came about isn't because people are like, oh, now we should let people get divorced for whatever reason. But the reason is that people that want to get divorced were lying under oath to get the divorce under the adultery clause or abandonment or what have you. And so what America decided was, we'll just allow no-fault divorce because we don't want people to get used to lying under oath. And that's what you have to keep in mind with these systems, is that they're based on the consequences to the people, the living people at the time. And the other point that a Orthodox Jewish friend of mine, Ron Coleman, pointed out, that just because a rule is on the books doesn't mean that it was ever implemented, right? There are like weird rules in my town where it's like you're you're extraordinarily liable if you ride a donkey backwards or something.
Really?
And yeah, or these really unusual laws that were put in place because something happened, but they actually never get executed because no one meets the conditions. And that's sort of the thing, is they are not going to, like the rabbinical Jews who keep the thoughts of how jurisprudence worked at the time and the context of the culture, but they're instead sort of cherry picking these things that sound gross to a modern, and oftentimes misinterpreting it. The other great example of this is if we followed Mosaic law, basically everyone involved in the American slave trade would have been stoned to death.
Exactly, because they kidnapped the slaves, and that was forbidden.
Yeah, they either kidnapped slaves or purchased slaves that were kidnapped.
Exactly. I want to point out, GPH is in the chat and just said something that I think is relevant. He said, Deuteronomy 23:15, do not return a slave to his master if he has taken refuge with you. Let him live among you wherever he chooses in the town of his pleasing. Do not oppress him. And that in itself is very much unlike antebellum slavery.
Yeah, exactly. And that's actually the point that the Christian abolitionists made, and that's sort of why the Fugitive Slave Act was such a contentious issue between one of the reasons between abolitionists and I don't want to call them closed slave owners. Let's call them that, right?
Slave owners, yeah.
Yeah, because even American slave owners didn't necessarily look at the institution as a unalloyed good. They kind of looked at it as just the way of the world. And, you know, like you said, Christianity over roughly a period of 1,000 years eliminated slavery using Paul's method, which is if you can get your freedom, get it. And then we literally fought a war in America at the cost of much blood to eliminate it. And so, you know, we talk about this, and then the other thing is there are basically only one non-Christian modern abolitionist society, and that's Amnesty International. All the other abolitionist societies who are against human trafficking, slavery, and so on and so forth throughout the world are all Christian, and that's sort of a key part, is that slavery is something that Christianity, it's a natural evil, right? It's not always a moral evil. It can be, but it's something that Christianity is fighting against.
Great points. And I also want to highlight, and this kind of builds off of what you said, but when people think that it's a part of society, if we went back to ancient times when slavery was reported in the Bible, which is basically, to me, a history book. So if they pretended that slavery wasn't there, that would be obviously a lie. But slavery was very prevalent all throughout the entire world. So it wasn't like we just made up slavery, or the Israelites were just engaging in slave practices. Everyone had slaves. It was something that formed the foundation of their economies. And so to say that God was going to basically say no more slaves, it would be basically to take their economies away. But what God did, that I think, and I think this also builds on some of your points, is through the ages, ever since the Bible started being recorded, through all of those ages, we've noticed that humanity is consistently getting a little bit better each time we strive. And I think God has the idea that we're striving for perfection. He's shown us exactly what the exemplar is of perfection. And as people try to interpret what Jesus said and what Jesus did and how he lived, we realize that we want to try to be like him. And so when people look at Jesus and they say, well, what would Jesus do? Would Jesus have a slave? Would Jesus go and kidnap people from Africa and bring them over here? Would Jesus beat anybody up? And you just look at his modeling and you realize that's why one of the reasons, and you say, look at how Jesus treated women, because women right now in the West have some of the best treatment than any other part of the world. Christians were involved in eliminating the foot binding practices that we saw in China. Christians were involved in eliminating sati, which was that idea where a widow in India would kill herself on a stake if her husband died. Christians have been involved in a lot of really great things. We also eliminated this whole idea of gladiators and people going into the Colosseums and going into these fights for their lives. So
yeah, and
Indeed.
I'll chat a little bit about that too. Is that the idea that women need to consent to their marriage is a Christian idea, that actually they inherited from even Old Testament Judaism. And even in systems of arranged marriage that existed in the Middle Ages, the both members of the couple, actually, and it's actually in the liturgy, were asked explicitly, "Do you consent to this?" And if they did not consent, or they were forced, then the marriage was invalid. And the other thing is, that gets a lot of flack, is this idea of what's called coverture. Coverture is basically that when a woman got married, legally she did things under her husband's name. And the reason they did that is basically the person who had to go to court and stuff was the man. And it wasn't that her personhood disappeared any more than our personhood disappears when we're in a town, but it's a question of who was the default representative in legal course cases. And like in medieval England, the person who went to court to defend the town, or in place of the town, was the priest. And that's what coverture was about. It wasn't about the rights being eliminated and the woman only being property. It was who gets the short end of the stick when you have to go to court. And you can see this, like widowed women represented themselves and owned property and so on and so forth. So it isn't, at least in the West, women have never been property under Christianity. And it's just a inaccuracy to claim that coverture was making women chattel.
That reminds me, if I used to make a joke that if I got a nickel for, or actually I'm gonna say a quarter or a buck, if I got $1 for every time I saw an atheist come onto my either my Twitter site or somewhere place like that and say, "What about 1 Timothy 2:12? Shut your mouth, woman." What do you make of that?
Well, the first thing is that this is the public sphere. So even any issues of specific church congregational discipline don't apply. And the second is that there are examples of women proclaiming the gospel to the heathen and being martyred for it. And third, that even Paul had his theology corrected and expanded by early Christian women. And most of the stuff that Timothy is talking about is related to basically right ordering of how things should work. And a lot of it can probably be looked at as a specific pastoral letter to a context. And, you know, the issues of church discipline are what's necessary to retain orthodoxy and the right things there. And it's absolutely hilarious when these atheists claim that it applies to proclaiming the gospel to the world or to secular contexts that aren't even there. And you know, that's the rebuttal I would make.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I think just pointing to Priscilla and Junia and Lydia and some of the other early church leaders who were actually very involved in the whole process of sharing the good news. I think when we look at those people, and in some cases, these women were actually funding the ministries. So they were very respected and well involved. And so to pick out that one little verse and say, well, this must mean this. And I've heard different interpretations of exactly using the original language of exactly what that verse meant that actually doesn't mean exactly what people think it means now. So
Absolutely. And we cannot forget Phoebe in the book of Romans also.
Good one.
Also, the women at the tomb, all these things speak to the elevation of women during this period when the predominant view across the ancient Near East and even further was that women didn't have a high status as men. So the very fact that early Christianity spread with women in leadership positions, this was a revolution. This was a revolution of thought.
Yeah, it really was. So women were given a lot of great rights back then. And I even the idea that Christians were very heavily involved with schools, education systems, and higher education systems. In the days before that, a lot of times the only people who were educated were the wealthy people and especially wealthy males and wealthy soldiers and that kind of thing. The ones who were being cared for in the hospitals were typically the soldiers. But women and people used to leave their babies who were females out on the streets to die if they didn't think that they could take care of them. So women really were having pretty awful treatment. But then as soon as Christianity came in, we started seeing these really great changes towards how people treated women.
Absolutely. And leaving infants and females to die, that's because a man or a boy was viewed as more intrinsically important, or extrinsically, I should say. The gospel, or the belief in God and the universality of sin, gave way to the eventual end of that practice. And you had church leaders, bishops, so many people in Christendom speak out against that practice, calling it a sin. That's why it stopped. It was predominant among the Romans, and many Stoics even said it was a common practice and it was okay. Although there was, some every now and then that would speak out against it. It was Christianity that put an end to that. And it was Christianity that put an end to slavery, both times calling it a sin and saying a person had intrinsic worth.
Exactly. The
Mhm.
whole idea of individualism is something that Christianity was very much supportive of. And that's led to capitalism in the last couple of 100 years. And it's led to a lot of prosperity in the middle class. So we didn't have middle classes like we do now if you go back before 1800. And people lived off, in today's dollars, about $1 a day back then.
Absolutely, absolutely. In economics, there's something called trade-off. Y'all were mentioning, or y'all were discussing earlier, why didn't God, condemn these passages, or something that atheists frequently bring up? If God would have done that, would the people been in? Would they understood it? First of all, if you are open to the possibility of something called progressive revelation, then people can understand things through the progression of time, through contemplation, prayer, and you get a more sophisticated understanding of God. Just as the sciences over time have become more sophisticated, well, theology and philosophy. And it's no surprise why today more people believe in God. And when you hear these radical 4 to 5 to 6% of atheists calling believers out of their mind, it's very ironic. Yeah.
Andrew, did you want to comment on that?
Sure. I guess the first thing is these things about how men and women should be respected as men and women actually go beyond Christianity in roots in the Old Testament, and that this can actually be seen in things like Proverbs and actually even the interactions that David has with wise women and things like that, and that this is very, very deep in even the Hebrew roots of Christianity. The other thing that I would say is that Christianity acknowledges two very important things that are in conflict in human nature. Is that one, we are actually individuals, but we also exist in community. And at one end of the spectrum is sort of this radical individualism of anarchists or like Ayn Rand, who believe that all we are individuals and we don't necessarily have any duties to others except perhaps the contracts that we make. And then at the other end are these forms of collectivism. The most extreme is certain forms of fascism, where your purpose is just to be a cog or a cell in the superorganism of the race or the state. And the truth is that we are individuals, but we are also bound to others in these relationships of love. And in some sense, we actually resemble the Trinity itself more than we realize, that our existence is not necessarily just our individual, but it's in the relations that we have with others and in love. And that's actually a key part of why we're able to do things that benefit ourselves and others. Is the articulation of that is to love yourself as you love your neighbor. And the thing is both of those are connected in a very deep way, and that we basically have to love God, ourselves, and our neighbor to the maximum ability. And I have some criticisms of modern capitalism, but the sort of market systems that evolved in Europe are actually seem to be some of the least friction. They have the least friction and the most stability to provide the natural goods necessary for human flourishing, especially when you compare it to things like just pure sustainment or centralized economies and so on and so forth.
And that's.
Go ahead.
Right. No, I was just going to say, even if you look at today, I wrote a little blog on the Declaration of Independence and Thomas Jefferson and his whole idea of all men are created equal. We're all entitled to the idea of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And he talked about being created under our Creator. And so we look at that kind of thing, and the whole idea of the pursuit of happiness, the pursuit of relates a lot, life and liberty and everything else. It's a very individualistic sort of statement, but it relates a lot to saying we want to work hard. We want to be industrious. We want to maximize our potential. And that could speak to our spiritual potential and other sorts of potential. And we want to do all that kind of stuff because that's actually in line with things like the parable of the talents and all of the calls and proverbs that basically say the lazy man is going to not do anything. And even in the early church, when you look at Paul sort of scolding some of the people who weren't doing their fair share. So that's one of the things that's behind these systems, is it's saying, if you can't work and you're truly needy or you're truly disabled or something like that, where you really can't do any work, of course, Christians are told to provide for you. But if you can work, then you're expected to. And so that's one bottom line.
Yeah, definitely.
So that also brings up another thing that is a way that Christians have changed a little bit, is the idea of saying all men are created equal is actually a pretty revolutionary thing when you think about it, because in a lot of places, like you mentioned, China and India, when China had that one child policy, most of them wanted to have one boy. And so they would abort their females, or if they had their females, many of them would give them up for adoption and that kind of thing. And so now there are about 5 million more males in China than females. And that's a problem. And in India, they also have a problem with the retention of female babies or female infants. They don't even want to let the females see what the babies are in the ultrasounds because they don't want them making choices to eliminate the pregnancy because it's a female. And so the idea of saying all are created equal and we don't have a distinction on humans is pretty important. In the Muslim faith, they think that women have half the brains of men. So there needed to be 2 women to get up and basically go into a court to represent one man. And so I've looked at academic studies, and women do not have half the brains of men. In fact, our IQ scores are on average about the same. In fact, they are the same. They're not statistically significantly different. So that in itself speaks to the dehumanization. And my third point is that when we do allow dehumanization of either women or slaves or babies in abortions, when we say they're not women or they're just tissue or their brains are half of what men's are, that's when we see the terrible persecutions and the very morally reprehensible treatment for people.
Yeah, and I'll try to be very precise. The equality that we all have is equal dignity and worth and spiritual potential. So we definitely have different natures, and the nature of a man is different than the nature of a woman, and by individual as well. But the fact is that we're all made in the image of God, and actually instantiate that image in our lives. And to reject someone merely for being different in that nature is tantamount to blasphemy, because you're actually rejecting the image of God that is in them. And this is sort of one of the key ways that belief in God grounds moral obligation, because God is the most sacred thing possible. It's the most sacred thing. And through his creation and making the man in his image, that is giving a sacredness to human life and articulating that this is a fundamental aspect of reality that must be respected. And you're exactly right, is that basically the key errors of especially the 20th century are dehumanizing others. And that's what the key problems are, and that allows it to infect our institutions. It's far different to dehumanize someone versus just be like enraged at them because they betrayed you. And in some sense, once you dehumanize someone, there's no limit to how far you can go and how evil you can become.
Well, that's exactly it. And that even goes back to Nazi Germany. So you have Hitler in Nazi Germany basically saying that in 1919, he came out and he said that Jewish people were a problem. They needed to be exterminated. And of course, we know what he did. He started propaganda and he started dehumanizing Jewish people, saying that they weren't fit to be mixed in with the German race, that they were rats. He actually called them rats, and they ran all kinds of promotional materials indicating that Jews were rats and they were infesting Germany. So he was able to essentially dehumanize them in the minds of the people who carried out his horrible mission. And so, again, like you mentioned, some of the issues in the 20th century are when humans are dehumanized, and we can learn a lot from that. And I think we can learn also the idea of dehumanizing women, dehumanizing different religious groups. It really isn't fair to say that because you're not in the majority group here in the United States, for example, that you shouldn't be given the same rights as people who practice this particular faith. That wouldn't be fair. And I think that's one of the nice things that the United States has been founded upon. And the third one, again, going back to abortion, when I was, and I don't know if you know this story, but when I was pregnant with my second son, I was at 12 weeks. I went in to get my ultrasound and my amniocentesis. And the nurse said, "Oh, it's the son." Oh, we could tell because all the body parts were there. You could just see the little boy. And the nurse said, "Well, he has two soft markers, echogenic bowels and echogenic heart. And those are two soft markers for Down syndrome. So if the amniocentesis comes back and says that he has Down syndrome, you can terminate the pregnancy." And I thought, what? Terminate the pregnancy? That's not even that's not saying murdering my son. That's saying terminate the pregnancy, as if he's not a human. He's just a ball of tissue. And I could see quite clearly he was a mini human at that point. So it really made me sick, and I became pro-life immediately.
Yeah, that's right. And the other thing that people don't realize, or often don't realize, is women especially actually start to develop that motherly relationship with their children while their children are in the womb, and it just grows from there. And it's really difficult to negotiate this issue because it seems like it's obvious why sort of the pro-life side is obstinate, right? Because that's a human, and that human deserves. We have a duty not to murder people. We have a duty not to unjustly kill people. But there's a obstinance that is difficult to get over, and one of the more humorous things, at least for the traditionalists, is occasionally someone who's pro-choice would be like, "Well, I'm willing to prohibit abortion if men are financially responsible for children from the moment of conception on." And the traditionalist, of course, says, "Yes, I agree totally. That's fine." And that's I guess one of the disappointments and greatest difficulties is we're in a society now where we don't have that universal grounding, right? And it doesn't necessarily have to only be Christian. I mean, if we had, for example, put a Muslim, a practicer of Judaism, a Christian, and a Hindu in a room together, and they would come to some agreement on how things would work. And the Muslim would say, well, abortion is permissible if there's no heartbeat, because that's where they view ensoulment as occurring, is when the heartbeat happens. And the Jew would say, well, abortion is not permissible unless the life of the mother is in grave danger and there's nothing else that can be done. And the Christian would say something like, well, abortion is not permissible, but you can do operations that aren't aiming at abortion to save the life of the mother. And then they would negotiate and figure out exactly what the laws were. And that's sort of the key thing, is that even though we have differences on how we view this question, we can come to a negotiation through the democratic process if we're clever enough and put our brain and energy into that. But it seems like that's not what's happening in America now, and a lot of it is down to how do I enforce my view on the other rather than fulfilling what I believe is a sacred duty.
I agree. And, for a long time there, I did look at the idea of the heartbeat, and I thought, okay, well, maybe that's the cutoff point. But then I changed my mind, and I've changed it to conception. But I do want to say something just to add to that, is we're seeing these views in different states. Like, for example, in Alabama and in Georgia, they've outlawed abortion for anything, even including the 1% or less than 1% cases of rape and incest. And then you go into places like New York, where they're or even in Illinois, where the idea of partial birth abortions or late-term abortions have been acceptable, have been determined that they've changed the laws now where some of those kind of cases are acceptable. And to me, that's going way beyond the envelope. That's taking the envelope and shoving it all the way down to a real fully grown baby and saying, okay, well, mother at 6 months or 7 months doesn't want to force the birth, or if you want to say that, some people say, well, what if the mother finds out that the baby has a particular medical condition, and so she doesn't want to give birth to the baby, so instead they kill the baby and remove the baby. I always say, even if you found out that the child has a medical condition, can definitely not survive, I still think you should give birth to the baby, hold the baby, and at least be a mother, and if the baby doesn't survive at that point, that's obviously terrible, but at least you tried, you gave birth, you don't have something that's going to be killing your conscience for the rest of your life.
Yeah, and that's a key thing, and I know a lot of women who have been totally psychologically destroyed by having an abortion. And I'll put it this way too: literally every infant born is a special needs baby, basically, and there's a huge amount of effort that goes into caring for an infant. And the other thing in America is there's something like on the order of 6 or 7 couples waiting for an infant to adopt for every infant put up for adoption. And it's, if anything, based on that demand, we have a lack of children in America, not an excess. And that's a really utilitarian way to look at it. But the people that want to take care of these children are there, and even if they weren't there, it would be still wrong to kill them. And I'm sort of a hard ass, and I'd say, listen, these people that are extremely pro-choice, I'd much rather they just argue that parents have the right to execute their children because children are under their authority. But we get into these really hard to defend, inarticulate things with right to privacy and so on and so forth. And I guess that's my philosophical background, but it's definitely something we need to discuss and figure out what is actually the transcendent value that we're trying to articulate. Because just saying that it's a huge problem.
Well, yeah, I think we should not be afraid as Christians to let an idea control us, but we put our faith in God. We're all controlled by some ideas. We need to be mindful of that. But the idea that life is intrinsically important and all life is created by God, we should be brave enough to stand up or to argue in the public square, respectfully argue that abortion is intrinsically wrong, and there's a better way to do that. As you said, there's people waiting in lines for adoption, and if they can't have a baby, then there are people that are willing to do that. I often hear that that's something that you brought up earlier, Andrew, conflating the issue of abortion with adoption. Like, people will not say abortion is wrong or outlaw abortion until all the kids or all the child's needs are met by law, and that's kind of utopian thinking. We have to trust and we have to do our best to help people, but we need to take a stand and let that idea that life is intrinsically important. We don't need proof of that. That is a something we can trust in and still stand up to the secular crowd that denies that.
That's a point I just wanted to go back to, just to again repeat what Thomas Jefferson said in the Declaration of Independence. He said, "We hold these truths to be self-evident." So they're axiomatic. Basically, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And if you just go to life and liberty, people are entitled to their life. And the United Nations said something very similar in its declarations. But basically, the idea is you're entitled to your life. So the only way that people feel like they can get away with abortion is because they've essentially said this is a non-human. And I've heard people say babies aren't even babies until they're born. Babies are not humans until they're born. And I think that's the justification. They claim that the baby's just a ball of tissue. So if people just realize that this is a value we all share to life, and to also recognize that at conception, a new human life has formed, then I think people will change their minds on some of their positions and at least at the very least don't have an abortion themselves.
Well, you brought up life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I believe by people not letting an idea or having a starting point as God is, something that we think is the objective locus for truth and morality. They'll put those things on the same wavelength, at the same hierarchy of value. I think life, and I think we need to use our common sense, but I think we can affirmatively say and courageously say in the wake of even criticism that some things like abortion are objectively wrong and still hold to liberty and the pursuit of happiness. Those are important things, but we have to recognize all three of those things, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, within the context of God being at the top of our hierarchy of value.
Yeah, and I have a sort of idiosyncratic way of interpreting that. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Happiness is the state, the perfect state of living in perfect virtue and union with God. And the liberties that we're guaranteed are the liberties necessary and helpful for that pursuit, and the same with life. And the sort of key thing that Jefferson is working on is that idea of happiness comes from this classical and Christian idea of virtue ethics, of pursuing happiness, not in sort of this hedonistic way, or I get to choose what happiness is, but happiness is fulfilling my role as a being in love to reality and the others that I'm responsible for.
Yeah, if I could just add one more thing. The pursuit of happiness, what our founders believed in that was something called eudaimonia, that something good in its own sake, that virtue ethics, something that which can't be, measured in utilitarian type fashion, bringing the happiness to the largest number of people, but something good in its own sake that takes wisdom. So I totally agree with you. Virtue ethics and placing God at the hierarchy of all that.
Good. So great points, both of you. And yeah, I like the idea of talking about Aristotle's ideas with virtue ethics and also the idea of eudaimonia. And I think talking about the founding fathers is important too, because I've noticed that a lot of people online are like to say, well, some of the founding fathers were deists, or they weren't necessarily Christian, so you can't say it was a Christian nation. But there is we have a lot of things in our current system that have been founded on at least Christian principles, even if it's not specifically mentioned that it's Christianity.
Yeah, well, I mean, the key question is, and this is sort of the identity crisis we're going on in America, is what is the culture that we're going to try to preserve and go through the future, right? And all the founding fathers came from this English Christian milieu, even if some of them might be deists. The Jefferson, you can make the strongest argument for being a deist, but like John Jay and George Washington and these others were Christians. And the other question is,
John Adams too.
Yeah, and John Adams too. The other question is, what type of society do we want to live in, right? In some sense, it doesn't matter if America was founded to be sort of this French Revolution style secular state. It seems to me, at least, that that's not serving our needs as a people and a culture. And so, even if America wasn't founded as a Christian nation, perhaps it should be.
Well, that's what Alexis de Tocqueville, when he came over in, I believe it was the 1830s, and he trying to reform prisons. He was trying to investigate the prison system, and he saw all these communities being formed, these outlets, and how religion played and specifically Christianity played such an important part of society, way more than in England or in France. There were many other, I don't have the research right here, but many other thinkers and people that came over to America. They were so surprised that religion wasn't as vibrant in England, where it was official, but when you have a non-official separation between the church and the state, which doesn't mean a radical separation, but just means that the church, the state doesn't control the church. You have people competing, churches competing. So I think, I would say, and I think Jordan Peterson would say, the structure, the hierarchy in America, well, there's something about that, and churches have played Christianity has played such a important and pivotal role and continues to do so in America, where it's free to do so.
You're right. And I want to add to that just a book that was written by a German, Max Weber, in the early part of the last century. I think it was around 1905, called The Protestant Work Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. He just noticed that Christians in the United States, and especially Protestant Christians, were very focused on working hard, thrift, saving money, and investing. And he said that drove capitalism, and that actually made a really big impact on our society. And if you look at what's gone on since then, our impact in capitalism and a growing middle class has influenced the entire world. So we even see in 1992, I think it was, or 1991, India opened its doors to trade. China's much more opened its doors to trade. We had the fall of communism in 1989. So we've just seen a lot of great things coming out of our society, and a lot of it is founded because of its original founder, Jesus. So we have his example. Yeah. We've been trying to live like him, and all of the great things that he did has really influenced the world in so many positive ways.
I'm a lot more cynical about the export of the American neoliberalism around the world, because oftentimes the markets are opened only if things like abortion rights are articulated and things like that. But there is definitely a very interesting connection between the Christian religion and the technological and industrial prowess of the West. And I'm not sure that industrial prowess is a good in itself, but it definitely does help us feed the needy and heal the sick, and so on and so forth.
I want to piggyback on that, because I want to make a kind of switch gears a little bit. But something you're saying is striking me. Atheism, and I've seen studies on this. So Ron Engelhardt, who does these things called the World Values Surveys, it's longitudinal studies. It's a waves of studies that he's done over the past couple of decades. He's identified a trend away from the church and away from tradition and towards secularization. He calls it Eurosecularization, and towards the idea of more people becoming atheists, which we've seen in Europe. And studies have shown a lot of the reasons, or the social safety nets, have taken people out of the churches where they used to go and help. And they have the government is providing the welfare and that kind of thing. And so actually, I looked at a study, the Globe study, and I found something that was super fascinating. And what it was, and this Globe study came out in 2004, but it was a study of 62 societies, and they looked at income levels, GDP, all that kind of stuff, and turns out that the societies with the very highest levels of humane orientation, which is another way to say benevolence, tend to be the societies where people are the poorest and they're suffering the most. And the societies with the lowest levels, the one with the lowest level is West Germany, but the other societies with the lowest levels of humane orientation, so the least benevolent, happen to be in Europe, in those European countries where they've become more secularized. So I think that speaks to the idea when someone asks me, they say, well, why does God allow suffering? I say, well, where suffering is the most, people are the best. We have the best characters in the places where people are suffering the most. So God is working in a very diligent and careful way to build character. And I think that's what he cares about. He doesn't necessarily care if we're comfortable and we've got a fluffy pillow and he doesn't care about that. He cares about building strong character.
Yeah, and that's exactly right. And it was even obvious to these noble pagans. The Stoics said the world is a machine for making sages, and their concept of a sage is sort of a perfect human being. And the Christian would say the world is a machine for making saints. And that's sort of the thing, and it's really a weird thing in modernity and certain types of progressivism, that we think that physical comfort in the sense of not being in pain or whatever is something that we should strive for rather than the maximally meaningful life. And you know, just as anyone who's been an athlete or practiced athleticism knows, to become stronger, be it lifting weights or running or what have you, you have to go through discomfort. And the actual going through the discomfort actually helps build your character and your ability to focus on what's truly important. And, you know, this is a very Christian idea, you know, the wealthy man and Lazarus, right? That the wealthy man had all these creature comforts, but he forgot to take care of his soul. Well, Lazarus, the beggar, had no creature comforts, so the only thing he had to focus on was his soul in some sense.
Yeah, I like that. I like that. Duncan, did you want to?
Yeah, absolutely. The British, I believe she's a sociologist or a psychologist. Her name is Grace Davies. Grace Davies. She's written a book, I believe it was in 95, Believing Without Belonging. That is, believing, being Christian, but without belonging to any particular church. In England and Britain and all throughout there, all throughout the UK, and in Western Europe, people have such an ingrained understanding in history of Christianity that they can have the liberty to do or go off what they want and say what they want, but at the same time they're living out Christianity in the way that they treat people, the way that they do things, the way that they do commerce and um, and so forth. But Grace Davies has really brought that up. And by the way, to measure if secularization is happening, a lot of these surveys go over church attendance. And that was one of, I believe, Grace Davies' points. A person in England or so forth can be a Christian but not go to the church every week or maybe only on special occasion. So I'm not persuaded by this secularization thesis. By the way, in the Enlightenment, I'm talking about Voltaire and other thinkers, Rousseau, they all predicted the end of religion. Voltaire predicted the end of religion in, I believe it was 1770 or 1750, where he lived, within 50 years. Uh, they, there have been so many of these so-called, super intellects that have been predicting the end of religion and secularization. It hasn't happened. there is no contradiction. So I've read enough on this, and I'm not buying into it anymore.
You know, one of the things that turns people off in secularization is they see values start to crumble, and they see things that they used to value and they used to hold dear and they used to hold sacred and pure start to crumble, and they get disgusted by that. And if we go back to the Roman Empire, and you brought up the idea of the pagan lifestyle was really immoral. Pagans were doing all sorts of sexually immoral things. They even made, some of this kind of stuff has been evidenced on pottery and other things that they've recovered, the ways that they treated people. Prostitution was rampant. It was perfectly okay. It was perfectly acceptable in the minds of a lot of them. And they pointed to the Christian women. There were some people extra biblically in some accounts where people said, wow, what's going on with these Christian women? They're actually loyal to their husbands. They're not divorcing. They're not running around and prostituting themselves on the side. And so people's values started moving. They looked at the Christians as being moral exemplars. And so they started wanting to be like Christians because it was more in line with what their inner guidebook or their inner conscience was telling them was correct. And so these days we're starting to see, you just see it in all angles. You see this idea, I've seen bestiality brothels in Europe. I know I mentioned that and all the atheists go crazy. I've noticed that in some places they want to legalize prostitution. We're seeing that people are talking about not going to church as much now. And the one survey I mentioned, I should mention, Duncan, is that it was a self-report on church attendance and also on whether or not people believe in God and if they hold religion sacred and those kind of things. But when we start to see the values shift and this idea of abortion and some of the other things that are coming out, people eventually start to get disgusted and want to go back to their old traditional values.
Yes, that's right. And especially when kids or teenagers or young or in the people in their 20s leave the church or leave Christianity, very often they come back to Christianity or to a specific denomination later in life. So, a lot of it has to do with, just using their new freedom that they think they can do things, at a young age, go party and so forth. But when they grow in wisdom, a lot of times they come back to the church.
And a lot of them come back to the church because they have kids and they decide, wait a second, I want to give my kids a foundation and I want to make sure my kids have this moral exemplar. If you, for example, choose Jesus and choose Christianity, you might say, I want my kids to know this. I think that it's not fair that they wouldn't know this. And so a lot of us come back, and I say us because I'm one of them.
Yeah.
So I left the church and I came back.
Yes, I'm sorry to interrupt you. In Western Europe, there may well be some secularization, but look at the southern hemisphere. You have South America, you have Africa and Asia, you have China, where Christianity is exploding. Christianity has never grown at this faster rate in all of history. So a lot of these countries, areas that that have been familiar with luxury and with abundance, leaving God, but with people that have to, that are growing, these areas that are growing, they're finding their roots. So I don't know if Western Europe is evolving or devolving. It sounds to me, especially with all the things you brought up, there's a lot of devolution going on.
Yeah, we do see some of that. So that's another interesting point. I think we're coming upon almost an hour and a half. And so what I'm thinking that we might want to do is, if anyone has any questions, please ask them. Or if either of you would like to maybe make a couple of final points, I think that'd be great. Unless I see some questions, and I haven't seen any yet.
Just sort of re-emphasizing what Duncan said. At this point, Africa has more church attendance than medieval Europe did. And there have been periods of time where there have been very little devotion to the religions in Europe. And the key question will actually be the demographics and how much they reproduce, right? Like you guys were saying, you're very conservative with what you teach a 5-year-old, because a 5-year-old will actually believe you. And as these people have children, if they do have children, they'll likely go back to what they were raised in, just out of that natural tendency to be very careful with what you teach your children. And the ones that don't have children, well, I mean, I don't mean to be too Darwinian, but if your beliefs lead you not to propagate those beliefs either to your children or to others, your beliefs will disappear.
That's true. That's true.
And that's what's also happening in Britain and in Western Europe. A lot of these secular-minded people aren't having kids as often as the religious. So some have projected in a number of generations. I'm not sure how many you might be able to tell us, SJ. But Britain may become a predominantly evangelical, or at least widely observing Christian culture again, at least on the outspoken Christian culture. I think it still is, um, but that's what I think.
Good. Yeah, and I think you're right. And I think that you brought up some good points as far as birth rates and that sort of thing. So that is a challenge that a lot of those developed countries have been having, is they're not making as many babies as we'd expect. And another issue that some people have pointed out is the increase in the Muslim population in some of those cultures, and the Muslims are having lots of babies. And so it might end up being there's more Muslims in Europe and it might actually change the whole flavor of how Europe is. Maybe even within our lifetimes.
Did you hear what the Dalai Lama said?
No.
The Dalai Lama said, Europe, I think I'm paraphrasing, Europe is for Christians, and he doesn't like all this Muslim immigration to Britain, to London. Now I'm paraphrasing, but he said something very close to that.
Yeah, he said something like Europe is for the Europeans, and he's been articulating mildly nationalist sentiments recently. And that's sort of the weird thing is, and Nassim Taleb, who's Lebanese, basically saw the same thing happen in Lebanon, where they let in a lot of Palestinian refugees, and it basically caused the Lebanese civil war. And there was a dramatic change in how things were by allowing this mass immigration. And it's really destabilizing and something that we really haven't seen before, this level of immigration. And everyone wants a better life for them and their children, and sometimes they are legitimate refugees and so on and so forth. But this is sort of an interesting thing that will happen, and well, let me put it this way: even all the migrants that are coming to Europe are religious, and so if Europe is to have a future, whatever peoples are in Europe will be religious.
Very interesting stuff. So I want to say thank you to both of you for coming on today. I think we've had a delightful discussion. I think we talked about a lot of different issues and some really important topics. And so I think maybe, hopefully, you'll dispense some of the views that people had that were questioning certain aspects of the Christian faith. I've heard people like R and Ra say that religion has to go and religion serves no purpose. But I think we've shown today that there's a lot of really great outcomes from Christianity in people's lives that are very material and very immaterial even. So that's just a very positive thing that we've seen. So would you guys like to share where people can find you, or if you want them to find you, if there's an email or if there's some way that people can get a hold of you?
Sure. Stratelates at Twitter and redpillreligion.com.
Great. And Duncan?
Yeah. I think I'm just Red Pill Religion.
Okay, Red Pill Religion. And then I just opened up, I'm on Twitter at LEAD1225. That's lead 1225. But just for fun, I was convinced by a friend of mine on Twitter who's called Sacerdotus that I should look at Gab. So I went into social media, I went into gab.com and set up an account. So if anyone's on Gab, I think I have one follower and it's Sacerdotus. And you can find me at SJ Thomas in there. So if you want to find me there, that'd be great. Or go to Christian-apologist.com. So thank you so much, everyone. The guy's going to come back.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you. I'm going to go ahead and stop the broadcast.